what we're going to be going over today is workflows. And so just a quick agenda here. Some of you might be quite familiar with workflows. Some of you might be brand new. We want to touch on a bit of everything for everybody. So starting with just very basic, what is it, workflow introductions, how to create one, that sort of thing. We'll walk through that. And then we'll go all the way, time permitting, to quite advanced things that we can be doing within the CRM and our workflows. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So that's the agenda there. First of all, I want to establish, what is a workflow. It's important to establish because, people have different definitions based on different systems that they work in or different experience they have. So in this context, a workflow is going to be something you can configure within BluMortgage. And that configuration, once you've completed it, is going to trigger a automated action, and it could be a series of automated actions. So it's just a way to set something up so that you're having that automated action happen when you want and how you want it. That's really kind of the best way to put it. So that's what the workflow does, and that's what the workflow editor can do for you. Each workflow is going to consist of a trigger, a condition, and an action. We'll get to that and what that means in just a second. And then the automated actions, I've been talking about that. What you can actually have as an automation is you can have an email, a task get created for yourself, field updates within the CRM, and even custom actions, which is maybe some of the more advanced stuff. And so that's what a workflow is. And to my second point there, kind of the three parts, diving right into what it's going to start looking like into BluMortgage. I have a bit of a screenshot here. So this can maybe help visualize things for you. So this is an exact screenshot of one of the workflows I pulled from BluMortgage. And I don't want to focus on anything outside of the red boxes for now. I will get into that further down the line. But at this point, this is just a visualization for you. So the first, it's a trigger. That's what I called it. It's the when. So when do I want this automated action to happen? A condition, as the name suggests, it's saying, okay, is this going to happen anytime this happens, or am I going to check for something first? And then the action, which is the final part, which is my automation, which is really the end goal. So that's the overview of just kind of, okay, what are we going to be looking at today, and kind of breaking down before actually clicking around, what are we kind of talking about when we talk about a workflow. So now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go back over, and I'm actually going to reshare my screen, but this time I'm going to pop open BluMortgage. So this here, you guys should on your screen be seeing BluMortgage. And if you didn't recognize that screen, that's fine. I'll start from the home page here. So clicking on the home page here, this should all hopefully be familiar to everybody on the call, this view here. But since we're talking about workflows, I'm going to jump straight to it. If this, if you do have questions on anything that you see outside of workflows, please contact support, but we're going to be focused on workflows for now. So coming through here, I'll start with the settings. So this is where you'll go, the top right corner, wrench and screwdriver. This takes you to the back-end setting area. Once again, there's a ton of stuff here. Any questions outside of workflows, please contact support. Right now, we're going to be focused on this, the automation section, and specifically the workflow rules. So we'll click into here, and this is a hugely powerful area. I spend many hours of my day in here. Our developers spend even more, just because there is so many things that you can do and so many different ways to configure that. So we're going to kind of break those things down as we go through. So to start off, what I'd like to do is I'd like to make a very simplified workflow. So let's just do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into here and just hit create rule. When I do that, a little pop-up appears. It's going to ask me which module do I want to create my workflow in. So this one actually kind of confuses people a lot. It's kind of like our templates where you have to select a module. It can be a bit confusing sometimes. The best way to answer this question for which module is what conditions do I want to be checking? So if it's based on a date of birth for somebody, then maybe I want to do the borrower module, right? Because that's my condition. That's what I'm going to base it on. If I want to do, let's say, a mortgage based on a transaction type, so a purchase, for example, maybe I want to do mortgages. So that's what we can do here, and that's the point of the modules. And you know, select something for your partners, for your lenders, even. You can even do stuff for your emails. And time permitting, maybe we'll talk on some of the email workflows because they're actually pretty cool. So coming into here, we're going to start with mortgages, and I'm just going to say, call it whatever you want. I usually suggest actually putting something that's meaningful. So I'm going to say post-close actions for a refinance. I don't know, something like that. And I'll just hit next. And so now what I get in front of me is going to be something that looks fairly similar to what I was showing before, right? Hopefully the background kind of and that when part already looks familiar. And this is the workflow editor. So I had that screenshot before. And the first thing you're seeing is this one, which is the trigger. So you have 3 different triggers you can do on a record action, on a date time, or based on a score. And between all of these, you can choose whatever one you need based on your requirement. So real quick, record action, so you can have it, you know, hey, when I create a new deal, I want this thing to trigger. Or when I create or edit a deal, I want this thing to trigger. Or just when I edit, or just when I update a particular field. I could even do it when I delete. Some people ask, hey, why wouldn't I just always do create or edit? And the answer, I guess, is maybe you don't want it going all the time. Maybe it's, you know, create, it's a different action that you want, so you can get kind of granular on the trigger. My favorite is usually the field update. I use this a lot because that gives me a lot of control. I usually say something like, hey, when the stage updates, for example. This checkbox says whether I do this every time the stage is updated or just the first time. So that's what this allows me to do. The other one's a date time. That's one I'll actually get to last. And then based on a score. So in some areas, this is actually very seldom used. I hardly use it, but just to be complete, you can start scoring your leads and you can say, okay, well, if my lead hits a certain score, I want a workflow to trigger. I don't like spending a ton of time on that, but that's the idea of this. And then finally on a date time, and I'll come into it last because this is actually the one I'll use for this example. So we talked about post-close actions. So what I can do is I can just say, okay, 5 days after the closing date, right? So now I've defined my trigger. A date is a field actually in the CRM. That's what's very valuable about recording these fields, is I can now do workflows off of them. So I can say, okay, 5 days after closing at 8 a.m., that's my trigger. Condition here, so I could choose to do all mortgages, so actually not have a condition, but if I wanted to, I can click this, and I can come in here, and I can actually say, as the name, how I name it suggests, I could say, okay, I only want this to happen if it's a refi. So how am I going to do that? The first drop down is the field. So I'm going to say, okay, transaction type. I have a bunch of options here, contains, ends with, starts with. I just like is refi, right? And I can pop that in. And if I wanted to, I could add new other conditions. So I could say, okay, maybe I want the amount of the mortgage to be, and you can see that this is dynamic based on the field that's selected, greater than or equal to, I don't know, 300,000. So a pretty big refi, relatively big. The reason I wanted to show 2 is because I could also come in here, edit this pattern, and I can actually say 1 or 2. So by default, it's 1 and 2, which means it has to be a refinance and it's more than 300,000. But I could choose to come in and actually say, well, actually, no, I prefer it to be 1 or 2, right? So those are my options there. Hit save. And so I've configured the when trigger. I've configured the condition here. So I have an or, you can see it shows up there. And now this is where I get to have some fun and actually say, okay, what do I want to happen when these 2 things happen, right? So 5 days after closing and I have these conditions met. Well, I can click my instant actions. That's where I'll start, and you can see all the ones here. So I'll just really quickly run down each and every single one of them. So starting at the top, we're going to say field update. So this is a good one where I could come in and I just say, hey, I just want to update something in my CRM. I just want to mark something a certain way. So maybe what we could do, a common one that a lot of people ask for, is I could come in here and I could say update client type or something like that. And then I can actually say, go into my borrowers and say type, or status, contact status is and I can say client, right? So this is an example of basically how I can go in here and say, okay, when 5 days after the deal closes, I want that borrower to be marked as a client if they haven't done already. And I can just hit save and associate. So that's a field update, number one. Number two here is a tag. So I can just add tags. So maybe this is, I can tag this deal as a refinance, right? Define a new tag, call it a refinance. It's very easy to do like that. And now I'm tagging my deals. Some people use tags. If you have any questions on how tags are used, we'd be happy to help out, but it's just a way to very kind of quickly classify the different deals that you have. Email notification tasks, these are the most common ones. These are my favorites. So basically for this, let's just dive into each of them and kind of all the things you can do within this. So an email notification, let's just create a brand new one. Name it whatever you want. So refinance, email, post close. Choose the template. So we have a ton already built for you. I'll just do a random. This is one that comes by default in all Zoho instances. And my favorite thing to do within this is actually choose the recipient. So by default, you pop up, it's showing the mortgage. I can email the second borrower and the third borrower. So that's actually what contact email 2, contact email 1 means. It's the second and third borrower. But maybe I want to email more people. You can totally do that. You just have to come to this dropdown and start selecting others. So the borrower is going to refer to the primary borrower, the first one. So I'll just pop in their email and their secondary email. Maybe they have 2 emails. I want to email both. And this goes on and on. I could even email the realtor, right? Oh, I want the realtor to be up to date. Lawyer, I could have the lawyer up to date. And I can even go so far as to actually update users. So in here, I can actually say, okay, this person who's on my internal system is also going to receive this email. So you can really do whatever you want in terms of recipients. There's a lot of flexibility and freedom, which kind of makes one of my favorite tools in this email notification section. I hit save. And then finally here, you just say who it comes from. You can do a fixed email, or you can actually do the record owner's email, which is really cool. So if you have many people in your organization, you want the email to look like it's coming from the person who is working the deal, you do record owner. And then current user is the only other option here, and that's basically if you want to have it so whoever triggered it, right? So that's considered who the user is. So if it was a field update, whoever did the field update. If it was a create-based trigger, it's going to be whoever created it. That's what the current user means. And then I could just hit save and associate. I could even do a reply to email if I want. Okay, I could do this. So that's the email notification. Quite a few advanced things there, which is pretty cool. Task, once again, this is very similar to just creating a task by itself, but I'll go through the exercise just so you can see all the options. So we can see create a new task, come into here and saying, okay, new task. I set the due date of when it needs to be completed by, so 2 days. I could do it after the trigger date, right? So my trigger date right now is 5 days after closing, or I could choose any of the other fields actually in the CRM. So I could say, okay, well, maybe I need to have a trigger based on a condition on financing date, right? That's what I want the due date to be based on, and I can do that. Not started, I recommend doing that just so it appears on your to-do list. Priority, what it sounds like, and then just down here, I can choose to notify the assignee, so that means the person will get an email when this workflow triggers and they get the task. This is great for internal. I prefer this actually to emails for internal reminders. And then this here, I can even say, okay, on the due date or 2 days before the due date or 4 days before the due date, actually remind this person through an email or through a pop-up I can choose. And then just a description here, just, whatever. One really cool thing that I like too is in my tasks, I forgot to mention this up top, this reminded me down here, is I can say new task for, and I can dynamically put in field values based on what's in the mortgage. So I could come in here and type the number sign, hashtag sign for the Instagrammers out there. New task for, and I put that in, and I can start typing. Why don't I say mortgage name, right? So new task for, and then it'll dynamically populate that based on the mortgage name. So that's task. Everything else here is a bit more advanced, I would say. The create record is relatively new, maybe worthwhile checking out. But you could say, hey, I want to make a brand new mortgage, put in some details about the mortgage if I need to here. So I could create a brand new deal if I wanted to. Not a lot of people do that, but that's kind of a cool one. And webhook and function are a bit more advanced. Time permitting, maybe we'll touch on them. So we talked about triggers in detail, conditions in detail, and even actions in detail. And those are really the building blocks of a workflow. So you should be able to really kind of do a lot of things within that. To provide some, I guess, just being comprehensive here and kind of going into maybe some more of the advanced things, a couple cool things I like to show. So first off, up at the trigger, I really like this recur. So this will only happen if it's a date time, this option. But I can come in here and I can say, hey, I want this to recur every single month, right? So maybe it's not every month, maybe it's every year, right? So some people do this option if they want to do mortgage anniversary emails, right? So every single year, it's just going to be recurring. And that's how you can do that here. The other thing that you can do here, this is not so much, it's just a different way to kind of position the condition, is if I do a date, closing date, for example, there's a lot of, I just want to show the date because there's a lot of other options, and a couple of my favorites are age and days or due in days. So age and days basically means that it's in the past and how far in the past. So I can say, oh, it's less than or equal to 30, that's age and days. And then due in days is the opposite. It's in the future and how many days in the future. Well, I could say it's less than or 30 days in the future. That's what these two things do there. And then if I continue to scroll, I'll hit done here. Scheduled actions is another thing here. So this is a really cool one where I can actually say, okay, this gets to happen 5 days after, but then 1 hour, I could do even 15-minute intervals if I wanted, but I usually stick to days. So I could say, okay, 1 day after 5 days, so I guess 6 days after closing now. And then I can configure that, and now all my options become available to me again. And then I can continue to add them. I can add up to actually 5 other scheduled actions. So then I could say, okay, 2 days after that. So this is kind of a good way to do a campaign, right? If I wanted to have 1 email start and then a bunch to follow, scheduled actions are really good. One important thing to be clear, this is maybe a bit more advanced, but for each scheduled action, 1 day after, it's going to check the condition again. So it's not just, hey, if the condition was met the first time, all the scheduled actions will go. That's not the case. Instead, at each scheduled action, it's going to go back to the condition and check. So it's actually a bit better, gives you a bit more flexibility. And then the last thing I like to show, once again, kind of a newer feature, maybe a year or so old, but very useful, is you can add multiple conditions. So now I could say, okay, this is a refi over 300,000, that's great. But now I actually want a slightly different action or reaction for transaction types that is a purchase. Oh, let's do purchase, right? And next, define my actions. We'll just, I don't know, we'll do a field update. Doesn't matter. And I can continue to add this as much as I want. I think I have actually 10 different conditions. And what's great is if you have multiple conditions on the last one, this one will always be available. So basically, it's like a catch-all, mortgages that not meet any of the above conditions. Hit next, and I can do my actions. So that's really it. I kind of breezed through, I would say, the scheduled actions piece, but I don't want to minimize that because that is actually a very powerful thing that a lot of people use. But we talked about really the trigger, condition, action. We talked about the recurring. We talked about different ways we can do conditions, scheduled actions. And as you guys can probably, I hope your wheels are turning for everybody watching this of really all the things that you can do within there. It's really set up to be quite expansive. So I'm going to spend about 2 minutes here, and this, if you're not like a techie person, you don't need to pay attention for 2 minutes. What I'd like to do for 2 minutes is just talk about functions for a second. So once again, these are quite advanced, so if this doesn't make sense to you, that's, you're still going to be fine using BluMortgage. But this is for people who really want to kind of start getting their hands dirty. This is what we do a lot, for example. But when we come in here, I want to show you one example, and this is this update preferred name on create. So one function that we like to implement from time to time is a function that says, hey, when the first name is entered, or when a borrower is created and the first name isn't empty, I want to automatically populate the preferred name with the first name. Now I could try doing a field update, right? And I could say, well, why don't I just say new update, and I say preferred name equals, but then I can't dynamically put something in here, right? It's going to have to be a fixed value. So that's not useful. So instead, I have to do a function. And really with the functions, you can just do about everything. So I'm going to click in. I'm going to show you how we configured it. I'm not going to go step by step, but I'm just going to kind of show you at a high level of how you can start configuring these things. So I'm going to hit edit. And the first things that you notice is it asks for arguments. So this is actually what's going to be an input to your function. So we're going to give our function the contact ID. This is the backend ID, which allows us to do actions to that particular record, and the first name. So when a borrower is created, what we're going to pass to our function is the ID of that borrower and the first name of that borrower. And then when I edit the function, I see actually what happens to it. So this is the function here, 3 lines, very simple. It seems, but there's quite a bit going on here, right? So the first thing we do is we define a variable, a mapping variable. The next thing we do is we say, okay, in that variable, in that mapping, we're going to say whatever we want or comes to us as the first name, I want to map preferred name to it. So preferred name gets mapped to first name that comes over. And now that I've completed that mapping, I need to just simply update the CRM, and that's what this does. So update client preferred name. I use this zoho.crm.update record. I update a contact. I use the ID to tell the system which contact, and I use the mapping to say what the actual update is going to be. So I'll stop now. I'm nerding out too much, I think. But like I said, if that's completely over your head, that's very normal. This is stuff that we do a lot, but not an expectation for a BluMortgage user to understand that. And that was just maybe me having a bit of fun. So I'll stop there. I'll stop sharing, and I'll open it up to general Q&A now. So please use the Q&A on the left-hand side of your screen to be able to answer your questions. You can also email me, thall@blueroot.ca, if you don't want public Q&A, and I can answer questions there. All right, so we got one question says, is there a way to set a condition to a trigger when a date minus 365 is equal to today? Yeah, so what I would do, Richard, in that case, is basically I'll just reshare my screen because this one is gonna best to show it. I create a rule. Doesn't really matter which rule it is. Mortgage. Rule name is date minus 365. And what I would do is I would actually go into date time, and I would do as my trigger 365 days before a certain date, something like that. So that's how you can do the trigger. And if it's a condition, instead, you just want to say, okay, I want something else to be my trigger, but I want the condition to be 365 days before the maturity date. What I could do is I could say, okay, maturity date is due in days. So that means it's in the future, equals, not less than or equal to, but equals 365, for example. Hit next. So those are the 2 ways that you can either set it up in the trigger, or you can use it in your condition there. So if this is not exactly what you're looking for, Richard, just reach out to support or myself, thall@blueroot.ca, and we can kind of hash it out. But that would be the most basic way to do that here. So I got another question here. How can we make certain that workflow rule is being executed properly? This is a common question. So I say, oh, well, I set this up. How do I know actually what's going on? So what I do, and I did this earlier today, what I do is not so much here, but let's just say, I don't know, mortgages here. I'll just choose one. I know that, for example, I'll just use, well, I'm not sharing my screen. Let me reshare. So I know that when, for example, in my test system here, when I click and drag something to underwriting in progress, I know a workflow needs to trigger. That's the way I've set it up. So I click and drag, great. Now I'm like, well, did the workflow trigger? What the heck's going on? How you can do that is you can click into the deal. You can obviously see the reaction. Maybe it showed up here, but my favorite thing to do is just go to the timeline. So you can see here on August 26th, that's right now, this is me at Eastern time, I can see that the stage was updated. And then I can see here that this workflow got triggered, right? And what happened is a date was updated, a task was created, and another task was created, and also a scheduled task was created. So I can see, and it's all, because I can see via workflow rule, and there it is. That's the workflow rule. So via workflow rule. So that's how I know that my click and drag, what I just did, actually had the desired reaction. So this is probably the best way to do that.